It is the 3rd of May, 1945. The war in Europe is, for all practical purposes, over. The guns are falling silent across a shattered continent, and in a modest headquarters building in Bavaria, one of the most decorated and feared generals in American military history is sitting across a table from men he despises. Not Germans, not Nazis, his own superiors. And they are asking him to do something that turns his stomach, to apologise to the Soviets. General George Smith Patton Jr. does not apologise. Not to enemies, not to subordinates, not to the press, and certainly not to what he privately calls the Bolshevik hordes now flooding into Central Europe. But the pressure bearing down on him at this moment is immense. It comes from Eisenhower, from Washington, from the very summit of Allied political power. Joseph Stalin himself has apparently taken offence, and someone, somewhere, has decided that Patton's mouth has become a diplomatic crisis. What Patton says in response, and more importantly, what he does in the weeks that follow, is one of the most extraordinary and least discussed episodes of the entire Second World War. It is a story of a general who believed he could see the future, who was willing to gamble everything on that vision, and who came within a razor's edge of triggering a Third World War before the second one had even officially ended. To understand why Patton found himself in this impossible situation, you have to go back several months, to the autumn of 1944. By that point, Patton's Third Army had achieved something remarkable. In 11 weeks of fighting after the breakout at Avranchy, his forces had advanced further and faster than any army in the history of warfare up to that point. They had swept through France, liberated thousands of square miles of territory, and driven the Wehrmacht back towards its own borders. Patton was the darling of the American press, the terror of the German High Command, and a source of permanent anxiety to everyone around him. But even as Patton was racing across France, something else was happening that would shape the final months of the war and the decades that followed. In the east, the Red Army was advancing with a ferocity and scale that dwarfed even Patton's achievements. Soviet forces had swept through Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. They had endured losses that are almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that the Soviet Union suffered somewhere between 24 and 27 million deaths during the war, a figure that encompasses both military casualties and civilian victims of occupation, famine, and deliberate murder. By the time Patton was being asked to apologise, the Red Army stood across the heart of Europe like a colossus. And yet Patton did not see liberators. He saw conquerors. He had observed the behaviour of Soviet forces in the territories they occupied, the looting, the systematic rape, the summary executions of anyone deemed politically unreliable. He had read the intelligence reports. He had spoken with the desperate Polish officers attached to his command, men who knew precisely what Soviet liberation meant for their homeland. And he had reached a conclusion that was politically explosive, militarily reckless, and, as events would prove, historically prescient. He believed that the real enemy had not yet been fought. The specific incident that triggered the apology demand was, on the surface, relatively minor. In late April 1945, during a press conference in Bavaria, Patton had made remarks that were interpreted as equating the Nazi Party with the American political parties, suggesting that governing Germany after the war would require working with former Nazi administrators, in the same way that Republicans and Democrats shared administrative duties at home. It was clumsy, it was politically tone-deaf, and it provided his enemies, both within the American military and in Moscow, with exactly the ammunition they needed. But the Soviets did not especially care about Patton's views on denazification. What alarmed them was something else entirely. Word had reached Moscow, accurately, that Patton had been speaking privately, and not so privately, about the possibility of continuing the war eastward, about rearming surrendered German divisions and turning them against the Red Army, about the window of opportunity that existed before Soviet forces could consolidate their grip on Eastern Europe. These were not idle fantasies. Patton was a theatre commander with armies at his disposal, and he was serious. And if you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The meeting between Patton and Eisenhower over the apology is not comprehensively documented in the official record, which is itself suggestive. What we know comes primarily from Patton's diary, a document that reads in places like the confession of a man who knows he is watching history being made wrong. Patton recorded that Eisenhower was furious, that the political pressure from Washington was overwhelming, and that there was serious discussion of relieving Patton of his command entirely. The apology to the Soviets was framed as the price of his survival. Patton's response, according to his own account, was characteristically unvarnished. He told Eisenhower that he would offer whatever formal statement was required, but that he would not change his actual beliefs. He told his diary that evening that he felt America and Britain were about to make the greatest mistake in their history. He wrote that within 5 years they would be fighting the Russians, and that it would be better to do it now, with a seasoned army and German auxiliaries available, than to do it later against a consolidated Soviet empire stretching to the English Channel. The 5-year prediction was, in fact, almost exactly correct. The Korean War began in June 1950, but Patton would not live to see it. And the story of what he actually attempted to do in those final weeks of the war in Europe is more alarming than the prediction. In late April and early May of 1945, Patton did not merely speak about rearming German forces. He actively worked to preserve the capability to do so. He ordered that surrendered German soldiers in his sector be treated as prisoners of war, rather than disarmed and demobilized, a bureaucratic distinction that kept them organized, equipped, and theoretically ready for redeployment. He made contact with German officers, including some of considerable seniority, and had conversations that went well beyond the formal terms of surrender. He positioned his forces in ways that maximized their ability to advance eastward, rather than simply hold territory. He also made contact with a figure who would become central to the subsequent Cold War intelligence world, Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen had run German military intelligence on the Eastern Front for years, and possessed what was, at the time, the most extensive archive of intelligence on Soviet military organization and deployment in existence. Patton, or officers acting with his knowledge, helped ensure that Gehlen and his organization were preserved and delivered intact to American intelligence, rather than being absorbed by the chaos of German collapse. The Gehlen organization would go on to form the nucleus of West German intelligence and work closely with the CIA for decades. Was this brilliant strategic foresight or dangerous insubordination bordering on treason? The answer depends heavily on when you are asking the question. In May 1945, with the war against Japan still raging, with Allied unity seen as essential to the construction of the post-war order, and with Roosevelt's successor Harry Truman still finding his feet in the White House, Patton's activities represented a potentially catastrophic breach of the political and military chain of command. He was a general acting on his own strategic vision, in direct contradiction to the policy of his government. Eisenhower, who understood both the military and political dimensions of the situation with a clarity that Patton consistently underestimated, moved quickly to contain the damage. The apology to the Soviets was delivered, in a carefully worded form that satisfied the diplomatic requirement, without requiring Patton to actually recant anything substantive. But Eisenhower also began the process of removing Patton from a position where he could cause further trouble. In October 1945, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army on the pretext of his continued controversial public statements about denazification. He was given command of the 15th Army, an administrative formation with no combat role, essentially a military parking lot for a man whose war was over. Patton accepted this with what, for him, was remarkable equanimity. He understood what had happened. He had been neutralised. He wrote to his wife Beatrice that he felt like he was being put out to pasture, that the people making decisions about Europe's future were making them wrong, and that history would judge the settlements of 1945 harshly. He was not wrong about that either. On the 9th of December 1945, Patton was travelling in a staff car near Mannheim when it was struck by a lorry in a low-speed collision. The impact was not catastrophically violent. Both drivers were essentially unharmed. But Patton was thrown forward and struck the partition between the front and rear compartments, sustaining a fracture of the cervical spine. He was paralysed from the neck down. 12 days later, on the 21st of December, he died of pulmonary oedema and congestive heart failure. The circumstances of the accident have generated controversy for decades. The lorry driver initially gave inconsistent accounts. Some witnesses reported a second vehicle that appeared to have been involved in staging the collision. The driver of Patton's car, Master Sergeant Horace Woodring, gave testimony that raised questions about the speed and positioning of the lorry. Subsequent investigations have not resolved these questions to universal satisfaction, and a number of historians and researchers have argued that the accident was, in some manner, engineered. The most detailed examination of these claims appeared in Robert Wilcox's 2008 book, which argued based on OSS records and witness testimony that an American intelligence operative named Douglas Bazata had claimed responsibility for arranging the collision. These claims remain disputed and have not been verified by independent documentary evidence. The official position remains that Patton died as a result of injuries sustained in a genuine traffic accident. What is not disputed is the timing. 12 days after the collision, the most dangerous and unpredictable opponent of the emerging Cold War accommodation with Soviet power was dead. Compared with Patton's vision and activities, the official Allied policy of those final months looks almost perversely accommodating. American and British forces halted at agreed demarcation lines and waited for Soviet forces to capture Berlin, Vienna and Prague, cities that Allied forces could, in several cases, have reached first. Eisenhower's decision not to advance on Berlin is perhaps the most discussed of these choices, and it remains controversial. His reasoning was primarily about minimizing casualties in what would have been savage urban fighting. Patton's view was that every mile of Central Europe ceded to Soviet occupation in 1945 was a mile that would cost blood to recover, if it could be recovered at all. History has not rendered a clean verdict. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe did impose 45 years of totalitarian rule on approximately 150 million people. The countries that fell behind the Iron Curtain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, the Baltic states, endured political repression, economic stagnation, and the systematic destruction of civil society. If Patton's assessment of Soviet intentions was correct, and subsequent events suggest that it was, then the question of whether a more aggressive Allied policy in May 1945 could have produced better outcomes is not an idle one. Against that must be weighed the near certainty that Patton's proposed alternative would have produced an immediate and catastrophic war. The Red Army in 1945 was not the force it had been in 1941. It had developed through 4 years of industrial-scale combat into arguably the most powerful land force in the history of warfare. Its artillery and armoured forces were the equal of anything the Western Allies possessed, and it had vastly greater manpower and a geographic position in Central Europe that would have made any Allied offensive extraordinarily costly. Patton's confidence that his forces could simply turn east and sweep the Soviets back across Poland may have been, at minimum, optimistic. The legacy of those weeks in the spring of 1945 runs through the entire history of the Cold War. The intelligence networks that Patton helped preserve became the foundation of Western covert operations against Soviet power. The political boundaries that were drawn while he was being silent shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people for generations. The questions he was asking about the nature of Soviet power, about the reliability of accommodation as a strategy, about whether the defeat of one form of totalitarianism was worth celebrating if it merely cleared the ground for another, are questions that Western democracies spent the next 4.5 decades trying to answer. He was by any objective measure a deeply flawed man. His anti-Semitism is documented and inexcusable. His treatment of soldiers suffering from combat stress was cruel and brought him into deserved disgrace. His ego was a strategic liability that his superiors spent enormous energy managing. He was brilliant, brutal, and frequently wrong about politics in ways that his military genius could not compensate for. And yet, on the central question of Soviet intentions in 1945, he was right. On the question of whether the post-war settlement would hold or would become the foundation of a decades-long struggle, he was right. On the question of whether America and its allies would eventually find themselves in a confrontation with the Soviet Union, he was right. It merely happened in Korea and not in Bavaria. On the 3rd of May 1945, in a headquarters building in Bavaria, a general was asked to apologise to the Soviets. He complied, in form if not in spirit. He then went back to his diary and wrote that he believed history was being made badly, that the men making it could not see what he could see, and that the consequences would be felt for a very long time. He was given command of a paper army and sent to write histories. He was killed in a traffic accident before he could tell the world what he knew. The men who had asked him to apologise went on to build the post-war order that he had warned against. And for 45 years, the people of Eastern Europe lived inside the consequences of the decision that was made instead of his. George Patton was many things, most of them complicated and some of them monstrous. But in the spring of 1945, on the question that mattered most, the loudest, most abrasive, most impossible general in the American army was the one who was telling the truth. History has a way of remembering the men who were right, even when it preferred not to listen to them at the time.